Hi Jackie, this is Anirudh here at the back.
Hi.
Man. So you are in the middle of the class of sorts, and we are sitting around the table here.
Okay.
So thank you very much for doing the talk today, and we really look forward to your work here. And we are hoping that we can get you from Bangalore to Mumbai at some stage.
Oh, absolutely.
Talk.
Absolutely. I will definitely come up.
Yeah, that'll be nice. I think we just have a little bit less volume, so can you just pick up the volume? Okay, I think that is better.
Okay. Can you see my slides?
Yeah, we can see your slides.
Okay. Okay. So I'm going to go full screen, which probably means you don't get to see my video. And then when we switch to questions and answers at the end, I'll put the video back on. What was I going to say? So, if you want to ask anything during the presentation, stop me. You may have to wave your hands a bit because it's harder to interrupt someone who's not in the same room as you. And it's hard to interrupt a social scientist anyway. But please do feel free to ask questions. Okay, so can you see it as a slideshow view now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. I was going to give you a brief introduction to the technology for emerging market area at Microsoft India. Then I'm going to talk about ethnography for design. I'm sure you'll be doing some ethnographic methods as part of your course, but I'd like to give you my take on ethnography for design because there's lots of different types of ethnography. And then I'm going to do a deep dive into one of my projects where we've moved from ethnography to actually design. And that's designing for financial inclusion. Oops. So, the introduction to the group. So we are a multidisciplinary team. Headphones are bothering me. There we go. We have a real mix of people from linguistics, social science, HCI, computer science, engineering, and then lots of research fellows who are largely dev, but not always. Research fellows, for those of you who don't know, come to us for a year or 2 years between doing a degree or a master's and moving on to a PhD. The multidisciplinary, so one thing I should say is the multidisciplinarity is very important to TEM. When you're working in this type of area, you really do need a sort of mixture of disciplines. So people who can build things, but people who also can understand what you might want to build. So this is our pipeline. It's fairly unique because we are actually able, and one of the reasons I work in industry or work here is because we can go all the way along the pipeline. We certainly don't go all the way along the pipeline for every project. So the first part is understanding existing and potential technology users and their context. So the importance for all of those you doing interaction design, the importance of understanding users obviously can never be underestimated, but it increases even more when you're thinking of contexts where your users are maybe living in rural areas, maybe don't have much money. Their lives are very, very far away from all of us, which includes you, who live in luxury in comparison. And so it's very hard to think about what users might need if you don't spend time with the people themselves. There's various methods. I'm an ethnographer, so I favor ethnography, obviously, but that's not the only method to understand users. And Bill, for example, doesn't do ethnography, and he's had some amazingly successful projects. But he does still at least go out and really try and understand what the problem is. If we see opportunities for technology after understanding the users, then we design and build prototypes usually. There isn't always a technology solution, and this is particularly the case. I would say this is anywhere, but this is particularly the case again when you're dealing with emergent users or low-income groups. Sometimes technology isn't the answer, and sometimes the technology there might be an answer, but it might be way out of our scope. So, for example, on a mobile money project I was on, the biggest problem, the biggest barrier to use of mobile money was the mobile money infrastructure. I work for Microsoft, not a telecom company. I can't do anything about the mobile money infrastructure. So that's not a place where you would want to do design particularly, unless you could partner with a telecom. So we really choose where to design and build. But if we see an opportunity, then we'll design it, we'll build it, and then we engage in iterative design, and I'll talk about the importance of this later. And then say we design and build something and we put it out there, a prototype, and it seems to be going well, then we want to evaluate it. We have 3 types of impact that we care about in Microsoft, which is academic impact. We're an academic research lab, even though we're in a large company, so we have to produce papers and be the best in our field and all of those types of things. But we also really, really, really care about societal impact as well. And then some people, not us particularly, may also have product group impact. But in TEM, our real interest is in not just academic impact, but societal impact. We want to make a difference. We want to improve people's lives. That's why we do this research. That's what motivates us. So to understand that, you have to really evaluate the technology in use. That's pretty complicated, and I will touch a tiny bit today on that, the complexity of that, but I won't go into it in much detail. Bill might have touched on it if he was talking about 99 dots. And then the next thing that we really want to do is say the impact is good, then we want to scale up. And this is the thing that I think is really unique. In most universities, you often have to finish after evaluate. But we actually have the opportunity to really take things into the real world. We often work in collaboration with NGOs, with academia and government. So we usually try and find a partner who can take our technology. But handing over a technology is not that simple. So you often have to work with them for quite a long time. And that's one of the values we have here, because in a university, you're often have to get on and do your next grant, your next project, and you don't have that time. So again, Bill's project for 99 dots is a real example of that. And so here are some example projects. They're a tiny proportion, but I wanted to give them to you to illustrate the sort of research continuum that we have. So we start at pure research and you go to deployment. And one thing I should make clear is you don't know when you first have an idea or you first start a project where it's going to go on this continuum, generally. You don't really know whether it's going to stop at study stage or it's going to go into real world. So I'll give you an example. This Ola Auto project, I was looking at, it was in 2015, so auto rickshaw drivers just started using Ola, and I did an ethnographic study to understand how Ola was impacting their driver practices. So we spent time observing people, following people around as they were using Ola, and following drivers around who weren't using Ola, and looking at the difference in their driving practices. This stopped at the ethnographic study because there was no way for us, there's plenty of technology ideas that came out of that, ways that you could improve Ola or other platform systems for the drivers. But there wasn't really anyone who wanted to take those ideas, and we don't have access. We can't create a new platform and then do all the marketing and then compete with Ola and Uber. That's not our business. So this study has stayed at ethnographic study stage, and it contributes to the conceptual arguments about the importance of gig work and digital economy in emerging markets. So it's more of a conceptual, it's more of an academic impact. But when I set up, I didn't know that was going to be I didn't know that's going to be the case. There's Krishi Pustak, which was one of Indrani's projects, where she designed Facebook for low literate users, in this case farmers. We used to call it Farmer Facebook. Basically, there's no text. It's images and audio. Now, this is a technology probe. She deployed it with farmers in the Mysore area. We knew that wasn't going to go any further at this stage because farmers don't have mobile phones and data at the moment. But it might be something that gets picked up again in 5 years or 6 years if a need arises. Then moving along the continuum, the project that I'm going to talk about today is this Prayana project, which went from ethnography to design. So this is a financial literacy project. When I set out, I thought that the Ola one was going to go from ethnography to design, and this was just going to be an ethnographic study. And then it turned out that there was actually a design opportunity here, and that's what we've pursued. So it's very ad hoc in many ways, and you just don't know where it's going to work. And then these two projects are really at the deployment stage, but there's still research going on, which is 99 Dots, which is the TB treatment project, and then CGNet Swara, which is a citizen journalism portal, which has solved over 500 problems for remote communities. So does anyone have any questions on TEM before I move on to the ethnography?
No.
Yeah. So, ethnography for design. And the for design is very important. Okay, so ethnography, as I'm sure you know, is a systematic study and recording of human cultures. It's the naturalistic study of human behavior. And the methods are very typically observation of naturally occurring behavior in natural habitats and communities, and the natural use of tools, artifacts, and devices. So you'll really see an emphasis here on natural settings. So that is the world as it is, not us manipulating the world or just interviewing some people. And observation, again, as opposed to other methods such as interviews. So why is observation so important? And if you know me at all, you know I'll bang on about this all the time. This is my favorite quote. Margaret Mead, an anthropologist, says, what people say, what people do, and what they say they do are entirely different things. And there is nothing truer than this. And this isn't because people are lying to you. It's just because people can't describe what they're doing in the detail that you need if you're going to design a technology to support them. If someone asked you what you did as a student, you'd be like, oh, I go to some lectures, I read a book, maybe I mock up some prototypes. So that's very, very high level. You don't tell me, if I was designing a technology for you, I would need to know, how do you get those books? Where do you get them from? Do you borrow them from friends? Do you buy them? How do you do your interaction design? I would need to know all the details that you are very unlikely to be able to tell me. And then also, going back to what people say they do as well, is when you what people say, when you ask a question in an interview, the answer will be the one that the people think is the answer to the question that they understand you're answering. The question that they understand you're answering, that you're asking rather, is not necessarily the question that you think you're asking. So you don't necessarily get the answers. And this, again, not because people are trying to deceive you, but because we all design our turns at talk to fit the people we're talking to. So I talk differently to you than I would to a group of ethnomethodologists, PhDs. You talk differently to me than you would to your mate. Okay, we just naturally design our turns at talk to fit the audience, and this is the same in an interview setting. Okay, so how do we get from everything I've been discussing? Really is very classic ethnography, which comes from anthropology. But when we move from anthropology to ethnography for design, a number of things changes. So anthropology emphasizes understanding cultures. It's typically very long studies. You might go and live somewhere for a couple of years to really understand everything about that culture. Ethnography in human-computer interaction is not just about understanding, it's about informing change. And ethnography in HCI are much shorter. And they're much more focused. We're not studying a whole culture. We can't go away and embed ourselves in a community for 2 years unless we're very lucky, because things move fast. The sort of design community needs us to be designing, to be building, to be creating much quicker than that. They're not going to wait 2 years for you to come back and say what you think would be a great treatment for TB or product for TB or for healthcare. But the way we get away with much shorter studies is this much more focused. So for example, when I was looking at how Ola Auto impacted drivers' practices. I followed drivers around sitting in an auto, following an auto in front who was either using or not using Ola Auto, and watched as they picked up passengers and went about their daily business. I didn't spend time living with their families, learning everything about what it means to be an auto driver. I would have loved to have learned everything about what it means to be an auto driver, but you just don't have time to do that. But this focus is useful for understanding how Ola impacts on their lives. It's not useful for being able to say all the things that an auto driver does. And the two places where we go in to do ethnography for HCI is where some technology has been introduced, such as Ola Auto, where we want to understand how it's being used, how it's affecting practice, and maybe if we can design it better. But also, we might look at places where we think technology might be helpful. So say we know that there's a problem with pregnant mothers in rural India. And they're not taking very simple health advice, and very simple health advice could improve both their baby's health and their own health. So you might go in and do a study there to understand what are the barriers, and then there might be a technology solution there. So there are probably as many types of ethnography as there are days in the month, possibly days in the year. I favour ethnomethodologically informed ethnography. Okay, that's a very long word, but all it means, and this I should say has had quite considerable success in domains such as CSCW, which is supported cooperative work, HCI. It's very useful for design. And the reason for this is it examines in detail the actual practices of members, that's people in society, what they actually use, and the aim is to uncover the methods by which the social order is produced. So we don't assume there's this social order that exists, like much as the sociology do. We assume that it's produced in all our daily interactions. So we try and understand what it is people are doing in micro detail. And that actually turns out to be very, very useful for design. We try to understand what it takes to accomplish the work from the perspective of those doing it. And then the second thing is that it's atheoretical. So we don't seek to assign a theory to what we find, either in advance, so that's hypothesizing, or after the study. Now that's very problematic if you're a university student in a sociology department or in a media studies department or something like that. But when you're doing design, you don't really need a theory because you're designing for the practices that you see here.
So, Jacki,
yes.
can I ask you something about that?
Absolutely.
So, but you still, I mean, if you are designing, you still need a theory about why something is happening because you need to generalize a little bit.
Why do you need a theory to do that?
So, okay. So how do you generalize? Okay, so because you may have talked to only 10 people and then you are sort of, you only 10 auto drivers and you want to kind of design for 100 or all the auto drivers. And you need to know why something is happening, or you don't really care why something is happening.
No, that's exactly. We don't really care why it's happening, but we care what is happening. So people only have so many methods for doing any one thing. If we can outline all the methods people have for doing that thing, we have a pretty good idea how people are going to act and how people are going to behave. I mean, the real academic answer is you can't generalize from ethnographic studies, and that would be my first answer. Okay, but the second answer is actually the things that you learn and the things that you see tend to be much more widely applicable. There are variations, but they tend to be much more widely applicable because we only have so many limited methods for doing things. So, for example, if I asked you a question, there are only so many actions that you can do. You can answer my question. You can ask me another question, which is typically a sub-question related to the question that I asked. You could perform any other thing you wanted, but everything else that you did would be dispreferred, so you don't see it very often, and it would be accountable. So if I asked you a question and you just started talking about something else, or you started jumping up and down and waving your arms about, and it wasn't a question that required you to do that, then you would be accountable for that. Because in society, we do things, we do things in particular ways. So there are structures in society, but what an ethnomethodologist would say is that we perform these structures through our interaction. So there's nothing to stop you doing random things if I ask you a question, but you generally don't. So the methods that we use are typically limited by sensibleness. Maybe. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's the theory. I mean, okay, so I understand what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Can I ask a follow-up question on that? So, I generally tend to work in the symbolic interactionist tradition. So,
Okay.
I completely agree with what you're saying, but I just had this thing about generalization. So, how much can we really generalize? Because we do want certain trans-contextual understanding based on whatever we are trying to build up from various particular situations or field work that we do. So could you comment something on that? How to come up with? I mean, again,
I know what you're saying. So it's a very tricky line to walk. But maybe I can answer best with an example from my own research,
Sure.
which is before I came to Microsoft, I was studying crowd workers on Amazon Mechanical Turk in India and the US. And when I came to Microsoft, I obviously had to stop doing that. I could have maybe carried on, but I sort of stopped doing that work. And I was like, that's a real shame because this stuff's just getting really popular. You know, our work's just getting known. What a shame I have to stop this research. But then I'm like, but never mind. You know, Thames really exciting. I'm going to do some interesting new stuff. And then I did a study of Ola Auto. So one of them is digital work where you have to have a certain amount of English literacy and a certain amount of computer literacy. One of them is auto rickshaw drivers driving around Bangalore. What's really interesting is the same problems arise for the crowd workers as arise for the auto drivers, and that's because they're both using a technologically mediated platform, which is a digital middleman which mediates between them and the people providing them with the work, in customers in the case of the auto drivers, riders in the case of the auto drivers, and often businesses or researchers wanting digital work from the crowd workers. So you can see that there are these issues which span different settings, but the only way to show that as an ethnographer is to go and do lots of studies. So you have to be very careful, particularly because the numbers people don't like us suggesting that our work has a wider implication, and we can't prove it has. And then if I can give you one more example, which is from the crowdwork stuff, we did ethnographic studies only, okay? So just pure qualitative data. There's a lady at the ILO, International Labour Office in Geneva, who's just done a massive survey of crowd workers in about 8 or 9 countries in emerging market economies. Okay, she has statistically found everything that we found qualitatively some years ago. Her results, of course, are generalizable, and I'm very excited about this, but my results don't count as generalizable because they're qualitative. So there are themes and there are things that run across, and we as ethnographers are pretty confident in the generalizability of our results, even though we can't really say that because you can't prove it.
Sure, thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, completely. Thank you.
Yes. And I have to say, I was so excited when I first saw her present her research, because I am going to use that every time anyone questions the validity of studying a small number of people very deeply. So,
thank you.
Okay. So then ethnography is not just interviewing some people. Okay, we've discussed why people can't tell you what they do. They have tacit knowledge. we care about all the tiny things they do. We care about all the tiny things that go wrong that they can't tell you about. And also, people can't tell you what they want always. Sometimes they have a clear idea of what they need, but sometimes they can envision how they might do things differently, or how technology can help. That doesn't mean to say it's not a good idea to do co-design. Co-design is wonderful, but don't assume that's the only thing that's going to get you to a result. Ethnography is not asking the manager what people do in the workplace. Okay, this is really important. Usually the manager has no idea what people do in the workplace. And what he tells you people do in the workplace bears very little reality to what they actually do. And this is the difference between the idea of doing specific tasks and then all the workarounds people actually employ in the field to get that work done. The manager often doesn't know about them. And it's not ad hoc anecdotes about what you did when you did something once. Oh my goodness, when I talk about the auto drivers, there's always someone who will pop up with an ad hoc anecdote about when they got an auto once. And it does drive me mad, because whilst we might not be able to generalize, empirical data collection, our data collection is empirical. It's done over a period of time. It's systematic, and we're very confident in our findings. And the reason we're confident in our findings is we look for patterns. It's not about seeing something once, although seeing something once can be informative, but you have to make a very clear difference between something you saw once and something you saw a lot. And it's not something that anyone can just do. And this is very common. Yes, no, I won't go on. It is a set of structured methods for understanding the world. And it is the production of empirical data, and this is really important. It's not just what the world looks like, but how it comes to look like that. And it's a skill built up over time. Whilst data collection techniques can be learned relatively quickly, and this is one of the things I really like, is that I can have young interns who come to me often from an engineering background, and I can send them out into the field, and they can collect great data with just a little coaching if they have the right mindset. Unfortunately, data analysis and writing takes years of practice, and so ethnography is something that's best learned through apprenticeship. And then how do we move, so I'm keeping an eye on the time, how do we move from ethnography to design? So this is important as well, okay? The aim is to understand the detail of how the work is achieved now, okay? But the aim of this is to design useful and usable technologies to enhance or transform that work. We don't just want to recreate digitally what's happening now. We want to change things. So what ethnography gives you is a really deep understanding of what the world looks like from the people who you might be building technology for. But design is necessarily creative. Okay, the study is just one resource for design. It's really useful in brainstorming design concepts if we understand what the problems are that people face on the ground, and we understand what type of things technology can do. You know, what's the cutting edge of technology if you work in a research lab? You can put the two together and you can come up with cool ideas for things that might actually help. Okay, but you then have to do iterative and user-centered prototype design, as I'm sure you're all familiar with, because the ideas you have, of course, change the work, and they might not change it in the right way. You might fix one problem and create another problem. Okay. So, any questions on that before I move into the deep dive? Great. So, I'm going to talk about designing for financial inclusion. We very specifically started out designing for the auto drivers, and that's where we are now. We believe that many of the things that we're designing will actually have a much wider applicability, but we don't know that yet. So, as I'm sure you all know, financial inclusion is a keystone of poverty reduction. It means enabling low-income communities to access formal financial services, such as savings, loans, insurance. In this research, so my focus is really on the provision of credit, which is absolutely vital to entrepreneurial growth and micro enterprises. So in India, so first of all, before I talk about what we've actually built, I want to talk about the sort of general financial inclusion problem. And in India, there's a number of financial institutions which serve low-income populations. So we have banks, we have microfinance institutes, but nonetheless, hundreds of millions of people are not able to access formal credit. So let's take a look at why. So banks, first of all, mainstream financial instruments typically exclude low-income communities for a complex mix of socio-economic and design factors. So there's been an extensive drive, as you all know, by the Indian government to make sure that everyone has a bank account. And they have been amazingly successful. I'm not sure what the latest figures are, but they've done a massive job of increasing the reach of bank accounts. However, a recent survey of 4 poor states in India found that only 12% of account holders used any sort of advanced services. And by advanced services, I mean saving, internet banking, peer-to-peer payments, credit. So that's only 12% of account holders actually do anything other than have their money in and take their money out of the account. And a key reason for this is banks are just not set up to cater to the needs of low-income populations. For example, many may earn small amounts of cash daily in highly unpredictable amounts. Because they earn, so this is thinking about credit again, because they earn cash daily, they don't have credit ratings. And actually, even people who are paid into their bank account typically don't have credit ratings because you often need a credit card to have a credit rating. And then thinking about loans, most loans have a monthly repayment schedule, but it's very hard for earners on an unpredictable daily cash income to save money even for a month. So at the other end of the spectrum, we've got microfinance institutes, which provide small-scale savings, loans, insurance, which have been designed for and targeted to the poorest populations. They typically have a strong social element to get around the credit rating problem. This is a key way they get around the credit rating problem. They might be built around self-help groups, such as the one shown here. Their services have been adapted to communities' income patterns, their education levels, and they're typically high touch with frequent collections. So there's often a lot of interaction between the MFIs and their customers. However, while they serve the poorest populations well, they're limited to small-scale lending, typically about 10,000 rupees. And there's a regulation enforced maximum of 50,000 rupees. So what we end up with then is a gap between those who are served well by microfinance institutes and those who might benefit from and be able to manage larger loans, but who are excluded from mainstream financial services. But we have non-banking financial companies, NBFCs, okay? They provide targeted services, rather like MFIs typically, but they can lend higher amounts. Okay? There's been a recent change in regulation by the Indian government, which means that small NBFCs, so big NBFCs are probably regulated as much as banks, but small NBFCs have lighter regulation. And this means that even microfinance institutes are themselves becoming NBFCs. Now, this is quite promising for financial inclusion, but lending to low-income communities has unique challenges not found in mainstream credit, which means it's difficult for NBFCs and microfinance institutes, to be honest, to scale up enough to meet demands. So this leads us to ask, can technology help? And we conducted an ethnographic study to help answer this question. We conducted observations and interviews of a social enterprise called Three Wheels United, which operates in this space, to understand the challenges of loan payment and loan collection. So Three Wheels United basically gives loans to auto drivers to buy their auto rickshaw, which costs about 1.5 lakhs. And at the time of the study, they were acting as an intermediary. So the loans came from mainstream banks, and TWU stood guarantor at the bank for the drivers, and then managed the whole loan from paperwork to collections. But it itself is now becoming one of these NBFCs. So they're changing themselves. So, and in the data collection as well, I should say, just because I was talking about methods. So we did a number of interviews of drivers using different payment mechanisms. But we also did, and this is absolutely crucial, we followed the collectors around on their collection rounds. And that's really where a lot of the ideas for the app that we designed came from. It came from observing what was going on when the collectors and the drivers interacted. And we also did observations of the back office, but I'm not really going to talk about the back office today. So, auto rickshaw drivers, just to understand a little bit about them. They have a range of... Was there a question?
If I could
Sure.
your question on the method. So, especially the 25 repeated interviews with 5 drivers, could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yes. So, basically, we were looking at in the study, we were looking at not just loan payments in general. In fact, I should probably give you more context because this is interesting for you as interaction design students, and it's also interesting to you in understanding that in ethnography you don't really know what's going to come out. You have to go in and you see what happens. So what we'd initially gone in to investigate was TWU had drivers who were using mobile money and drivers who were paying by cash, and TWU wanted to scale up their mobile money operations, and they wanted to know whether that would what impact that would have on the loans. So initially we did the interviews, the semi-structured interviews and the observations of the collectors and the back office work to understand what it meant to pay by Airtel money, as was being used then, and what it meant to pay by cash. We found that the biggest barrier to so why they were using mobile money is because drivers get paid daily. You would ideally want to do your collections daily, but cash collections are really costly to do daily. And so the idea was, well, if drivers can pay using mobile money, then they can pay daily. Unfortunately, what we found is that in Bangalore, there isn't the infrastructure required. So drivers get paid in cash. So to pay by mobile money, they have to change that cash into mobile money. At the moment, the only real way to do that at scale is going to an Airtel service centre, and there's only 20 of those in Bangalore. So if you live near an Airtel service centre, or you could persuade your local shop to do mobile money for you, then you were sorted and you could pay more regularly. But most drivers were not in that situation. So there was another mobile money company called NovoPay, which was targeting the low-income sector, just emerging at that time. So we put NovoPay in touch with TWU and said, why don't you arrange something with them? Maybe NovoPay. So the way NovoPay works is that it's a smartphone interaction because they're not a mobile phone company, but the person who wants to put in money goes to the NovoPay shop and gives the money to the NovoPay person who makes the transaction for him on his smartphone. So we suggested to TWU, why don't you get together with NovoPay, and they can open shops in the areas where the drivers live, because drivers typically live in sort of areas together. So NovoPay had agreed to do this. In the end, it didn't work out. So those 25 repeat interviews with 5 drivers over 2.5 months were done by Ishita Ghosh when she came here. And she basically was looking at NovoPay, and she was looking at drivers paying by mobile money in NovoPay over the 2.5 months. And one of the things of doing repeated interviews is you see how things change over time. Things come up that didn't come up before, and also you gain a lot more trust with your informants. So they're willing to tell you many more things, and also they will remember things that happened in between, and they'll start bringing things to you. So there's a lot of benefit actually to doing repeat interviews if you can find people who are willing to do them with you. But you tend to do it again on an even smaller sample.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Okay.
Ma'am,
Yes.
so ma'am, while we were doing the user studies last semester, we went to a family where there was this one person who was the main source of income, and she was very reluctant to use the bank services because she said that we already have low income and we cannot really trust other people with our money. So do you think that this system they will adopt to this system instead
You
of
mean mobile money?
yeah.
So I could do a whole talk on mobile money, but I'm not going to. Interestingly, so what was really interesting is the drivers adopted Airtel Money, even drivers with very, very poor literacy, print literacy. And Airtel Money is only in English, I have to add, not in Canada like Ola Auto. When they thought it was useful for them. When they and then I also, that's a very good question as well, because actually one of the reasons they adopted Airtel Money is because it was inserted into a trusted ecosystem. So the ecosystem between TWU, its NGO partners, which I'm not going to discuss now, and the drivers was an ongoing trusted ecosystem. And then one of the NGOs introduced Airtel Money into this. So they put in a lot of effort to make sure drivers could use it, but they also gave the system trust, which is not the case in your setting. So I think that's a really interesting observation. And that trust is really important for getting people to use technology.
Thank you.
Yeah. So drivers, oh, I should be quick. Okay, so drivers have a range of education. About 15% had no schooling, and typically that means they can't read and write. At the time of the study, very few drivers had smartphones and none had data, and we classify them as financially vulnerable. They earn about 600 to 800 rupees a day, but variability is high. Only a quarter had any savings at all. And they can just about cover their daily living costs, but they don't have spare cash for extras, whether that's medicine, school fees, or savings. So, as this driver says, when I can barely manage to cover my son's educational and household expenses, how can I save? So, TWU, I'll skim through this one quite quickly. So, they do frequent collections. They wanted to do daily collections, but as I mentioned, these are too difficult. They capitalize on social and community relations. So that's, again, how they get around the credit rating. They use a lot of the microfinance principles. It's not a group loan, but they use referrals, and they use they put drivers in groups so they can put pressure on each other they're not paying. And then this is very important. It's a 5-year loan repaid over 3 years, because in 3 years, a driver is going to have some sort of crisis, probably multiple crises. And by crisis, I mean a financial crisis, because that could be something nice like a baby or a marriage, or it could be sickness or a mechanical breakdown. If you don't have any savings, you're going to miss loan payments. The bank does not let you miss loan payments, but by paying the 5-year loan over 3 years, you've created a buffer so that if you miss some payments, you're okay. And then this is important for the app. The payments are split between the main loan, so that's a big loan for your auto. Drivers take out a loan for the deposit because most can't raise enough cash for the full deposit. And then they pay fees to TWU on a monthly basis. So, turning to the findings. All drivers put money aside daily, but putting money aside daily is not the same as paying daily. Money might get spent, or drivers may put less aside after a bad day. So as one of the drivers says, it's easy for me to pay 200 or 100 rupees, but when I have to pay more in one go, I can't save up. The money gets spent on something or another. Okay, and one of the points with this is that most drivers were behind in their loan at some point, and many of them were chronically behind. In terms of tracking the loan, individual payments are well tracked through receipts and account books, such as the one you can see in this picture. But there's no tracking of their progress through their loan. Drivers don't know how much they paid off of their loan. I don't know how much I've repaid or how much is left. I've been paying for 2 years now. Or one of the driver's wives, I'm not getting any details. I don't know how to find out the balance I have left to pay. So, and they didn't know how the money had been allocated between the buckets either. TWU tried to produce a printed monthly statement to share with the drivers, but this failed because collectors didn't have the financial literacy to interpret and explain loads of numbers, which is all the statement was, to the drivers, which were anyway, and the numbers were anyway out of date by the time they met them. So, from TWU's perspective, their troubles were they used an ad hoc mixture of paper and technical systems. That's very common in low resource settings. I'm sure you're going to see a lot of it in the field. They mainly used paper and SMS in the field. And so collectors themselves didn't have information on individual drivers or their set of drivers beyond what they kept in their heads. And they didn't know how the payments had been allocated for any driver into the bucket. In the back office, they were using an open source banking system, Cyclos, and then hundreds of Excel sheets for each driver. And because drivers weren't paying the right amount of money on time, it meant they had to manually allocate between the 3 different buckets, the main loan, the SDL, and the TWU fees. And this was time consuming and error prone because they didn't have the correct information because they couldn't open all the Excel sheets just to find what they needed. So the final set of findings are around the social dynamics of loan payment. And I have to say, we have really deep ethnographic findings. These have been synthesized and put up to a very high level to make a short talk. But you can read the papers if you want to know more. So loan management's a collaborative achievement between the collector and the driver. But the driver has to put money aside, and this means managing competing demands. Now, drivers have every 100 rupees, they have probably 4 things competing for it that are all quite urgent and quite immediate. They tend to prioritize the most immediate thing, the most pressing thing. And this means that the loan, which is long term, gets sort of pushed to one side. Because, you know, if I miss a payment now, well, it's 3 years, I'll catch up later. The trouble is they're missing one payment now and another payment later. And this means that the collectors end up doing a lot of work. They spend a lot of time phoning up the drivers, persuading them to pay, nagging them to pay, encouraging them to pay. They're a social enterprise, so they can't put any sort of bad pressure on them to pay. And they also do an amount of on-the-fly loan counselling, so they help drivers manage their money better. So it's really the social contract between the collectors and the drivers that enables payment. And I'm not going to talk about flexibility because of time. So what are the challenges for credit in low-income sectors? Borrowers' precarious circumstances of range of print and financial literacy are really the biggest challenges. But we also have other ones. Ad hoc paper technical systems are cheap and flexible, but they mean both borrowers and lenders lack information and they're difficult to scale. And also, loan management is a collaborative achievement between the collector and the driver. And this means this is a high-touch industry. So, this is onto the design bit. We designed Prayana, which is an intermediated smartphone app, which collectors use with the drivers. So the collectors have the app and they use it with the drivers to support the collaborative work of loan management. So it aims to improve the ability of borrowers to manage their loans by helping them understand what's going on with their loans, and it aims to help lending organizations to scale by streamlining and supporting their high-touch workflow. So Prayana is an accessible, for borrowers we have meaningful visualizations of loan information and we use nudges and social competition. For lenders, we enable better data collection and enable them to direct their resources and their time more effectively. And in creating this, we actually generated new organizational knowledge. We moved all the drivers' information to the cloud and we streamlined the back office processes, including building a generalizable loan algorithm. And I'm not going to talk about the back office today. So here's the app. So I call these borrower screens, but you have to remember that these are actually shared because it's the collector's app. We're later going to build a driver's app, but at the moment it's the collector's app. So to address literacy constraints, we designed a set of accessible resources which minimize the use of text apart from numbers and include clear graphical representations and color coding where possible. The app's in both Kannada and English. And one thing to remember is the collector is helping to explain these things as well, which that really helps. I have to say. So this first screen here is the borrower home screen, and this is a screen that collectors use to take a payment from a driver when they go to see the driver and collect cash from them. And you can see that we provide an at-a-glance awareness of how the borrower is doing through color coding payments. And in our iterative design workshops, the drivers understood this information very easily, i.e. if it's all red, I'm in trouble. If it's green, I'm doing well. Okay. If the payment history is mainly red, collectors can use one of the additional resources, such as the loan buckets. And you see how these moved during the iterations. From the initial design, we tried lots of different representations. We took lots of different ones with us. But drivers preferred the blocks because, and each block is a monthly payment, but they like it because they can simply count. So this is the final version where green means paid off, red means ones they should have paid off but are behind, and the white is to go. So they can see, they can easily count here, I'm 8 months behind in this case. We also designed a nudge. So at the moment it's got quite a lot of text on it. We're trying to redesign that. It's okay at the moment because the collectors explain it to the drivers, but when we move to a driver's app, we need it to have less text. So basically this is to enable the loan to compete more equally with other demands. So it shows when the driver would own their auto if they paid on time versus if they continue to underpay. In this case, the guy would get his auto 3 years earlier and would save 60,000 rupees if he just paid the right amount. Okay. Research suggests that very small nudges can have enormous impacts. But the underlying idea here of making the future consequences of today's choice salient now was inspired by Dan Goldstein, who'd done various visualizations for pension savings in America. And then the final set of screens for the borrowers are motivators. So this one's showing an auto filling up with color. As you complete 10% of your loan, it just pops up, and it's to motivate drivers over the long term. And then the other one is you get a hat trick 4 or 6 if you make the right amount, the equivalent number of payments on time and the right amount of money. And we're going to use these in a social competition that we're going to be designing in the next couple of months. So we hope that these simple visual representations will build financial literacy and help enable borrowers to make more informed choices. And at the very least, borrowers have much more information about what's going on with their loan than they did before. For the collectors, we want to enable them to visualize their borrower set. So you have 3 tabs here. This is all drivers. Then there's drivers you should call today. So these are drivers who are due to make a payment today. And then there's drivers who've not paid. So these are drivers who've missed a payment, who you haven't spoken to rearrange when they're going to pay. So really, collectors should call all the drivers in these 2 screens every day. The green means the driver doesn't have a debt. The red means the driver's got a debt on his total loan. And the idea of these screens is to enable the collectors to direct their attention to the people they need to direct their attention to. We also log call data through a call record. So we've got reasons, if it's will not pay, we've got reasons for won't pay, you know, sick, traveling. These are the common reasons that the collectors gave us. And we've got a star system, which is how likely does the collector believe. In this case, the collector really probably believes this guy really is sick. This information shared with the back office, and it creates new organizational knowledge about drivers' circumstances and status, although we will be evaluating how much the trust rating relates to what actually happens. So that's one thing we want to do. And if it bears no relation to what's actually happening, we'll remove it. And then we motivate and inform the collectors with performance targets and stuff. Okay, I'm going to skip the comparison with the other apps, but just to say that there's no other app uses this intermediated approach. So apps are designed either for the MFIs or for the end users. There's no one else who thinks about designing for both of them. And we have and most apps are not designed for low print literacy. So in a qualitative use test, Collectors could use the app to take payments and explain the loan to the driver, and drivers came away with a better understanding of their loan, specifically that it would finish later than expected because of underpayment. So the next stage, though, and all of our design with the collectors and with the drivers, I should say, was iterative. We did a number of design workshops and individual sessions and group sessions, and it really changed from what we'd originally designed to what the final looked like. The next stage is field testing. I don't have much time, but we'd hoped to do a before-after test. So this was the complications of evaluation. We'd hoped to do before the app, after the app. But because TWU is changing to an MBFC, it's gone from having 500 drivers with loans or 700 when we initially did the study, then 500 to about 100 drivers. And there's 4 collectors. And so the data is really variable. So there's no way we can compare before and after, because we're never going to show statistical significance, because you would have to have a massive impact to be able to be statistically significant with such variable data. So we're going to use observations, we're going to use interviews, we're going to look at log data for correlations between screens shown to the drivers and payment patterns. We're going to see whether there's correlations like that. It's disappointing we couldn't do an RCT, and we are looking for other partners, maybe in microfinance, who have a bigger user set where we can do an RCT, or a bigger evaluation, if not an RCT. So to conclude, we really set out by asking if technology could help fill the credit gap. And our ethnographic study revealed the complexity of giving bigger loans to marginal populations. So based on this, we designed Prayana to streamline and support the high-touch workflow, which is necessary for managing the constraints in this space. Our unique approach targets lenders and borrowers together. So one of the things that we think here is that, and this maybe touches briefly on the generalizable question, is that not only does our app have a wide applicability to grassroots organizations in India trying to plug the credit gap. Of course, at the moment, it's very targeted to auto drivers. But one of the things we want to understand is what we need to make that more generalizable to other situations. But also, financial literacy is a worldwide problem, as is debt. Personal debt. And while we were designing for low print literacy, actually what we've come up with are some simple visualizations about current status of what's going on with your debt and about the consequences of non or underpayment. And we think that these might have a wider applicability in other settings, because, to be honest, I lack financial literacy. Most people lack financial literacy. The only reason I'm not in trouble is because I get paid more than an auto rickshaw driver. So there might be, I probably would benefit, I don't have a credit card anymore for this very reason, but I would probably benefit from these types of visualizations. So one of the things we want to do is see whether there's a wider applicability. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah.
Hi, Jacki.
Hi.
This is Nikhil.
Hi.
So at the outset, we discussed about how ethnography is qualitative, a qualitative study. So do you see yourself at Microsoft Bangalore in the near future embracing a machine learning or AI-driven solution, which is data-driven again, in this ethnography pipeline, given how popular it has become? And then again, you get a point to justify how people who criticize ethnography, let's say, being a qualitative study and cannot be generalized. Do you see?
So yes and no. So we actually have a new researcher, Amit Sharma, who's joined. He's a computational social scientist, and one of the good computational social scientists, because there's lots of people who call themselves computational social scientists but are just big data people. But he actually does social science as well. So there's lots of opportunities. If you're in a setting where you have access to big data,
Yeah.
then absolutely it can be really good. And in fact, Mary Gray from New York, from Boston, and Sid Suri from New York Lab do some fantastic partnerships. Mary Gray's an ethnographer, and she'll do deep qualitative studies, and then Sid will run this. They're mainly working with crowd workers, and then Sid will run these massive online experiments that sort of, so this can be a great partnership. If you're looking at a setting where you have the data, because one of the things in low resource settings is there's often not being the same sort of data produced as when you're looking at like you or me. We produce a lot of data.
Right. So most of your work must have produced data, right? Until now, for example, Ola.
Yes, but we don't have access. So we have qualitative data, but we don't have access to Ola's. I would have loved to. We did go and talk to Ola, but they were too busy to really, you know.
Chatbot, for example, the work that Indraini was working on.
Yes.
A lot of they trained a bot based on the ethnography, database on the teenagers' ethnography.
Yes, so, absolutely. I mean, so where there's data, I think there's lots of opportunities for partnerships. I have no objection to those partnerships. The only time I object is when people tell me that I should be doing that, because then I say, well, you can say that, and that's some of the data scientists sometimes, because I say, well, you can tell me I should include that when you include a qualitative study every time you do a big data study. When we get to that stage, I'm fine, but I absolutely agree. It's a fantastic partnership. Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Any other question? Yeah, please.
Hi, Jacki. Abhishek here.
Hi.
My question is regarding the usage of mobile money. As we know that we don't have a unified payment method. There are like varieties of payment systems out there in the market, and which mainly causes the user to drift back to mostly rely on cash. So, can there be a possible solution if we want the user to use that mobile money as a priority?
Yes, I think that if you could, I know that there are people working in this space, and I think that if you came up with like a unified solution, and I know that the Indian government wants all the mobile money systems to be interoperable, and they've been talking about that for the last year or so. I think it's quite a hard challenge, and I think it would be very useful. But to be honest, it depends on where you are and what you're earning. For the auto drivers, it will happen when it's easier for their customers to pay them digitally, and for them to receive money digitally. Then they'll be able to use mobile money as a payment solution much more effectively. But at the moment, because they're mainly earning in cash, and they're mainly earning in cash for a variety of reasons, and one of them, as you're right, is because they might have Paytm, but the customer might not be using Paytm. So I think there is definitely opportunity in that space.
All right, thank you.
So, hi, Jacki.
Hi.
So, in the beginning of your presentation, you said that ethnography is largely about observing natural occurring behaviors of the users. So my question is a little generic, that I'm curious to know what skills does an ethnographer have, or how do they observe these natural occurring behaviors, which makes them different than others who do field studies?
When you say others who do field studies, who do you mean?
Not ethnographers.
But who apart from ethnographers do field studies?
Mostly designers or some sociologists.
Okay, what do you do when you do? Tell me what you do when you do a field study, and I'll tell you what's different. So, yeah, go ahead.
Context, we see how the user is doing his work, and apart from that, we see what are the other things surrounding him, what is the environment around the user.
Yeah, I think the main thing in my understanding of what designers do is, I was saying that ethnography is a much shortened version of anthropology. Well, my understanding is that when designers go into a setting, it's an even shorter intervention, and it's often not so much about observation. There's a bit of observation of look at the setting, but there's not so much shadowing people for a length of time. Where you are shadowing people for a length of time, and it doesn't have to be that long, but it has to be enough that you're seeing consistent patterns. So you're getting some sort of data saturation. That's a really important thing. Where you are, then I don't think there's any different. How you then interpret that data will depend on which whether you're symbolic interaction, whether you're ethnomethodology, whether you're development ethnography, whether you're, do you know what I mean? There are, as I say, there are probably hundreds of different versions of ethnography, and that's all about, mostly about the analysis rather than the actual thing. Sometimes people say they're doing ethnography when they're just doing interviews. That upsets me. but because I'm just like, no, you're doing an interview study, and there's nothing wrong with an interview study. An interview study can be incredibly useful, but for me, ethnography has to have some element of observation as well. So it's like yeah, who knows what the difference is. The main thing is probably around data saturation. I would say, but I don't know I'm only going on the little bit that I know about the designers that I know when they go to the field. So one thing is, when in Xerox, which was where I was working previously, people would go into the field to do, and they weren't designers, but to understand, to do work process analysis, to streamline work processes. But what they would do is they would do a walkthrough. So they would do a process walkthrough. But a process walkthrough is nothing like what actually happens in practice. A process walkthrough is much more like what the manager tells you happens. Because it doesn't typically include all of the workarounds. It might include one or two of them, but it often doesn't include all of them, and it often doesn't include really salient details. So when we were comparing ourselves, which is something I can more easily compare myself with, when I was comparing our ethnography to that type of Lean Six Sigma stuff, those types of ethnographies, we just had a lot more depth and we found a lot more of what was really going on than this type of walkthrough. But it's not like there's one right method. Okay, there are different methods depending on what you want to do. And when we're thinking about inspiring design, there's lots of different things you can do. Co-design workshops can be fantastically useful. Technology probes can be fantastically useful. Going in with some sort of paper prototype, do you know what I mean? All of these things can be fantastically useful. It just depends on what you want to achieve. And the advantage of ethnography in that case is it really gets to the heart of the problems from the people concerned. But it's not necessary in every situation, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have one question.
Yes.
Hi Jacki, thank you for informative talk. My question is related to two things. One is trust issue and another is a recovery. In the case of low income group, there is always a trust issue. How this non-entities bank, as you said, NBFC, overcome this trust issue. And in case of loan, the major standardized bank doesn't give low income group loan because of a recovery problem, or they are not generally reliable for a recovery. So how non-bank entities do recovery, or what sort of mechanisms they use?
Yes, absolutely. Two very good questions. So the trust issue in the case of Three Wheels United is they initially partnered with NGOs who were working in driver communities and had been working in driver communities for a long time. So they got their trust through the NGOs. TWU itself now has been established long enough and has its own NGO arm that it has a reputation and it has trust in those communities. But that is very, very important, and you never want to violate your trust, because low-income communities have often been ripped off by all sides. Do you know what I mean? So they have a very good reason to be untrusting. So it really is important. And then the sort of trust in the drivers comes from the community relations and the community recommendations. In terms of the recovery, the reason that banks can't do it is because banks are not set up. So when I'm talking about a high touch workflow, is TWU puts in so much work to manage these loans. The collectors are calling the drivers. In some of our core data, we've got 2 of the collectors calling one driver 10 times to get one single payment. Okay? Banks don't do this. Banks just expect you to pay the loan, and they expect you to pay the loan on a monthly basis, and they only intervene once you're behind. TWU does weekly collections. By the time a driver's missed 3 payments, they will be going around to the driver's house and discussing with the driver and his family what's going on. If you think of that in a bank situation, he hasn't even missed 1 month. The bank won't even know the driver's having trouble by the time TWU is intervening. So this is the thing. Banks are just not set up to do this type of work. But this work is much more costly because of all the manpower and the effort that goes into it than just giving someone a loan and expecting them to pay it back every month. And that's why you need organizations with a social charter to do this. So TWU, like most MBFCs and MFIs, is a for-profit organization, but it has a social charter, and its social charter is financial inclusion. Because if your social charter is making money, which is what the bank's social charter is, then you can't do this because it doesn't make sense from a cost-benefit analysis. So people often say that one of the financial inclusion problems, one of the credit problems, is that people don't have a credit rating. But I would argue that that's certainly a problem for people in the higher income sector. You know, maybe your cab drivers who are earning like 60,000 rupees, 50,000 rupees a month. But your very low income people, if they had a credit rating, their credit rating would be, do not lend to this person. And that would never get you anywhere towards financial inclusion. So that's why you need this super high touch workflow that's really designed to help the drivers manage their loan. You can't just give it to them and leave it to them. Does that make sense? And so one of the things we want to do with technology is try and support that high touch workflow and make it a bit easier so they're not doing as much work as they're doing now. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So the last question.
Yeah. We were talking about emergent users. As an emergent users, we were talking about more of localization in terms of language barriers.
Mm-hmm.
So, in the concepts which we have seen, again we are repeating on the English versions rather than local language thing. So, in terms of localization from your ethnography, what are the insights you got and how we are going to implement?
Yeah, so there's two language things. So one, it absolutely has to be in Canada, and it is in Canada. And if you go to other states, you absolutely have to put it into the local language of that state. But then, so one of the things that will be interesting is the next thing we're going to do is we're going to release a driver's app, because of geo, increasing numbers of drivers are not only having smartphones, but they're having data. So this means that we can actually give an app to them. That will include all the screens that we showed, but we know for a fact that those loan buckets are understandable for the drivers because the collector is there. Okay, so even though they're visual, they're countable and all that, to even understand what they mean in the first place, once you know what they mean, you can handle them. But to understand what they mean, it's the collector doing the work. He's intermediating between the information and the app. Does that make sense? So we had a slightly easier case to start with because we've got the collector there explaining this information. The red and green payment history, that was fine. Drivers had no trouble with that. The loan buckets, they could understand after they were explained, not just on their own. So if you have a driver's app, the question is, how long do they remember what they are? You know, if you log in newly, can you remember what that is? And then the nudge, we really have a problem with, because at the moment the nudge has a lot of language on it. And we need to change that, and I don't really know how to convey that information more visually. Numbers are fine. So I think we've got plenty of challenges ahead when we're doing a driver's app. But the moment we just cheated and we used the collector as our intermediary, and we tried to make it visual and color coded and everything, which we're quite successful with. But it's not that, you know, every single driver can understand that information without support. Yeah. So it's difficult. That's really my answer. And if any of you want to help us with the driver's app with some ideas of how to do that, we'd love to hear them.
So thanks a lot, Jacki, for taking out the time and you know, sharing all this work with us and showing up for this. And really wonderful to have you here. And
I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and we really look forward to having you maybe physically in Mumbai at some stage.
Yeah, no, I'll definitely come and visit.
Thank you.
All right then. Cheers. Bye. Bye.